Join me for a conversation with RPG podcaster Steve Morrison.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Okay, guys, be sure to do all of that liking, rating, reviewing, subscribing, all that podcasty stuff. That really helps the show out, and I would greatly appreciate it. Let's just jump in today. Here's the interview. My guest today is the podcaster behind Errant Adventures, Steve Morrison. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. It's my pleasure. How did you first get introduced to tabletop RPGs?
So I started playing tabletop games back in college, and I had not really had any experience with tabletop before that. I'd played some computer RPGs, but nothing with any tabletop, any dice, any physical sort of manifestation. And so I remember I was sitting in the common room of my dorm freshman year, probably about maybe a month into the semester. And I was sitting on the couch next to a guy who was in my dorm, and he was reading a Lord of the Rings book that I did not recognize. And at the time, I was very obsessed with Lord of the Rings. And so I struck up a conversation with him and asked him what it was. And he told me it was the Lord of the Rings role-playing game, and explained that, because I was a little confused. I was like, I don't understand. What does that mean? And he's like, oh, well, you create a character and then you can play in Middle Earth. And I was like, I need this in my life immediately. So he became my first game master, and we played a campaign of the Decipher Lord of the Rings role-playing game for a few months, and then we transitioned to D&D 3.5, and then we played a year-long campaign of Star Wars, the D20 Star Wars.
Oh, wow.
And then I think it was in my sophomore year, we had I think it was a years-long 4th edition campaign that another friend who was in that group was running. And so that was kind of my introduction to the hobby. And I sort of dove headfirst in, absolutely loved it. And other than for a very brief period post-college, I have been playing obsessively ever since then.
All right. Well, you said you just dove right in. What was it about the games that just captured you so much?
Yeah. So I think obviously the draw to play in some of my favorite settings was huge. I mean, Lord of the Rings and then Star Wars, kind of that 1-2 punch of those two things that have been pretty formative for me when I was growing up. Just being able to create a character and tell stories in those worlds that I loved was huge. And I have been writing fiction since I was very young. I mean, I probably like 10, I started writing short stories and stuff like that. And I essentially had 3 worlds that I wrote stories in. I would write Lord of the Rings fanfic. I would write Star Wars fanfic, and then because I was that kid, I read the Aeneid and the Iliad and the Odyssey for fun, and was obsessed with ancient Greece. And so I had a ancient Greek fanfic sort of series of stories that I wrote in as well. And so I just kind of cycled through those 3 settings, if you will, for quite a while when I was writing. And then I sort of branched out into trying to write my own fiction. And, my first attempts were very, very poor knockoffs of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
But that's where a lot of people start. And so I think then finding tabletop role-playing games and realizing that, I can do something similar to writing stories, but I can do it with friends around a table, and multiple people are interjecting their ideas. And I find that, brainstorming with people is so much fun, and you get so much more vibrant stories sometimes when you are in a group of people throwing ideas back and forth and just feeding off of each other. And so that really solidified my love of the hobby.
No, absolutely. And in fact, it was funny. I was going to ask you if you were a writer, because the way you described kind of jumping into tabletop role-playing games sounded a lot like myself and almost like 95% of my other guests who are writers as well, even some who haven't published anything. They are writers or interested in it. And I just always find that fascinating. I think that people who are drawn to writing are drawn to Dungeons and Dragons, tabletop role-playing games in some fashion. And I just find that fascinating. Just kind of over and over again, just like when I was basically like 6 years old, I said I was going to, write novels or whatever. And then when I was 9, I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and it was just on, right? Like It was just, I'm a character in this place, done. I do that all day long anyway. And now I get to do it with a group of friends. But I do think a couple things that you said there were really interesting. You talked a little bit about how the storytelling with a group kind of takes on a different dynamic. And I always find that is true as well, because I don't know exactly what it is. I think sometimes we can kind of, we imagine a story or we imagine some scenes and we kind of get stuck in that. But once we throw it into a group, maybe I wouldn't do that with my novel that I wrote, last year or whatever. But like when I'm playing a role-playing game, I can't be stuck in those ideas because other people are throwing in different things, and it's causing everybody to react to those. And I think it does create a really dynamic storytelling environment. Is that kind of what you were talking about?
Yeah, I feel like there is definitely, there is a place sometimes, especially, if you're trying to tell a specific type of story, to have a certain amount of preciousness with your ideas. But I think, especially in tabletop games, the storytelling can be so much more rich when you are less precious with your ideas, when you are more open to the idea of like, well, I have this idea of what I want to happen, but if somebody else also has an idea of what they want to happen, one of us is going to have to give at some point. Otherwise, we might, end up stalling out the game, or we have to come to some sort of compromise. And I think that's where that's where the fun of playing in a group is for me, is like, I have ideas for days. I mean, I write stories, like I've got all sorts of ideas for things. I don't necessarily need other people's ideas to tell a story, but it's a very different experience when I'm playing solo or when I'm writing a story by myself versus when I'm sitting around a table with my friends. And in those settings, I don't want to be the final arbiter of every idea. I want to open up that space so that other people can throw in ideas, because I really do think that when you have that multitude of voices at your table who are all driving towards some narrative, you have such a greater opportunity to build a compelling and sometimes just downright moving story that is uniquely yours as a group. It is your group's story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, even sometimes I think you're absolutely right, though, with the idea that sometimes as a game master, I may have a certain idea. I come to the table and I present that to my players. But once they start reacting to it, it takes on kind of a life of its own. And some of the mistakes I made when I was first starting to run games, fortunately, I was like 9 and 10 and 11 years old. But so I can make a ton of mistakes and there's very little consequence. But, once I became less rigid about that, once I present an idea and then just allow my players to change, I think a couple things happened. The stories got better, but also the players were more involved and more engaged in telling the story. And then, so even, at certain times playing the game, maybe our story isn't, it's not Shakespeare or something, it's not the Tempest. All right, we get that. But everybody is so engaged at the table and each player has put in ideas and the game master's put in ideas. You just get this kind of this communal buy-in to it. I don't know what else to call it, but like you just get this, this group right behind the story, and it just takes on, kind of a life of its own, and everybody is kind of surprised and everybody's pleased that they got input. And I think those are really important aspects there.
Yeah. And I think there is something really special about that synergy of ideas that you get at a table. And I mean, it sounds like you experienced the same thing in your journey through game mastering, but like I've done it all. I've done no prep, I've done low prep, I've done incredible prep where I, detail out every possible scenario and then drive myself insane, trying to think of all that stuff. And I really have fallen in love with the idea of like situations, not solutions.
Yes.
And that as a game master, I come to the table with ideas for where a story might go, but I don't have the answers or the final endpoints. I just hopefully have catalyzing events that the players are going to be able to react to, and that hopefully they're going to latch onto and be able to then throw out their own things that I can then take in the future as further catalyzing events.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's pretty much squarely where I have ended up now as well. And of course, I talk about that in my little book that I wrote called The No Prep Game Master, where like you said, I did all the things, right? I prepped like so much, right? Like I had notebooks full of ideas and plots and things, and by golly, you're going to follow these, right? That's what I was telling my players, right? And I've done the no prep, I've done low prep, I've been the game master who introduces his own PC character and tries to be the star of the show. I've been the jerk. I've been the competitive game master. I've been everything. I've been the pushover game master. I've been everything, right? And I'm able to take some of all of that experience. And I think you're absolutely right that you come to a place to where I will have ideas. I will have, maybe I'll have a setting idea and I'll just introduce that to the players, or I'll have situations and problems or complications that can occur. Throw them a situation and then add complications to that situation. And all of a sudden, I feel that there comes a story out of that. And at some point after a few sessions or something, you could kind of grab up some of those loose ends and pull it into some kind of arc if you really wanted to. And then, close out a campaign after how many ever sessions, because it just seems to arise out of, everybody's input. And once their characters start making those decisions and those situations start gathering, it just seems like you should always, to me anyway, it just seems like you can pull it to either mini climaxes or big climaxes, depending on how your campaign is going. I don't know if you've seen that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think, an element of randomness is important. And this is where, it's probably where I differ, some people differ with me, but I always think the idea of, even for the game master, at coming to certain places during the sessions where you just have a random table and you just say, okay, we've had, whether it's your players each kicking in different ideas and you rolling to see which one of them happens, or whether it's a pre-made random table to see what kind of situations or complications or what kind of items those people find. I think that also adds dynamism and can then just take the story into different places that you would not have imagined. Have you found that to be true as well?
Yeah. So that's an interesting thing, because I resisted the idea of random tables for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I always kind of had this maybe snootiness about it of like, well, I'm a writer. Like, I can come up with my own ideas. I don't need random tables for things. Mm-hmm. And then I started doing the solo gaming, mm-hmm. and discovered all these awesome Oracle tables and everything like that. And all of a sudden, it completely changed my mind and revolutionized the way that I play, where I was like, oh, wait, this is why I struggled so much when I was trying to run a no prep game, but I was also resistant to the idea of random tables. And so I was like, well, I'm not going to prep anything, but I'm also going to have to then come up with everything on the fly off the top of my head. And I would always struggle with that and feel very frustrated with myself of like, well, I must not be smart enough if I can't think up something, or I'm not good enough as a game master to be able to do this. And then when I came to solo gaming and saw the sort of the reliance on random tables for that, because you really do need that in that context, because you don't have other people sitting at the table to bounce ideas off of. I was like, wait a minute, why have I not been using these for the last however many years that I've been running games? Because all you need is a prompt, and your brain will be able to fill in the gaps with everything else. And so I have completely, like I said, changed my mind, and I love random tables. I've used like Ironsworn oracles and stuff like that while running D&D to randomly generate a dungeon and stuff like that, because why not? Like, those tools are there, and I don't have to think of everything anymore. And that's great.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when a game master, a game master can be hit with like 500 decisions, right? Like, absolutely. I mean, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of decisions. And I think there's, let's talk in real world terms, right? You come home from a day at work, you're fried, you have, a family and kids or wife and taking care of things. And then you're supposed to come up with The Tempest, sitting, at 8 p.m. on a Thursday night or whatever, for your group of friends. That's just not realistic anyway. And so, but I think, obviously I love random tables. I create books of random tables. I better love random tables, right? I mean, I have, by the time this airs, probably 19 or more books of random tables will be out. And this was something for me that I had learned years ago. I remember, back in the day playing D&D and just, when I was 9, 10, 11, 12, just loving the random tables, rolling on the random tables, just even for fun while I was watching Voltron or whatever. And then when I was playing Star Wars, the West End games, I played that a ton, and they did not have random tables, or at least at the time that I was playing. I know later on they came out with a few things right before the company went under, but my group was still playing that game. And I just remembered, the random tables from D&D. So I started creating some for my Star Wars games, and I just remembered the reaction of my players. They lost their minds, right? When I started coming and having random tables, the search tables or loot tables, they loved it when I pull out the loot tables. And when we have situations or other things like that can happen by random tables, there is just something, I don't know if it's, like I don't know why people gamble and things like that, but there's just something about looking at the possibility of results and rolling random to see what that outcome can be, right? There is just something in us, in our brains, in our minds, or something that is just like, oh my gosh, this could be the worst thing ever, or this could be the best thing ever. And I'm just and it's up to however this die rolls on the table. And there is just something to that. I think that, that really, I don't know, it just really creates extra feeling in people and really draws them into kind of the situation. And I also, find it interesting because I have certainly heard people say that there is a reluctance to use random tables because it seems like cheating, or it seems, kind of weak. Or, well, I could think of better things than that. And I always want to come back to say, like, if you're using a random table, like the random loot table in some of the D&D books, professional writers probably spent like 4 months making that, right?
Yeah.
That's
exactly.
That's no joke, right? Like, that's going to be, it's probably going to be better than what I can come up with, off the top of my head after I've, fried my brain dealing with life, all week, and then expected just to come up with it when a player asks a random question that, like, I had no idea, right? I mean, that's the way people are, right? You go into sessions and we're like, okay, I think these things are going to happen. And then your player says, well, what if we do this? And it's totally different, right?
Yeah, it's the opposite direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, oh, I thought you were going to explore the tower, but now you're going to the seaport to do something. Oh, okay. Well, years ago when I was 11, I would have said, nope, got to go to the tower.
Yeah.
But now it's like, okay, yeah, go to the seaport. I'll pull out a random table and roll on my tables and we'll see what's happening in the seaport. And I think that is, not only does it lend itself to the game, but I also think that's when you can just take a lot of pressure off of yourself as the game master, right? That,
I agree.
We need to chill out sometimes. I think we get a little uptight, and we can just take some of those decisions off of us, give some to your players, give some to random tables, because you've got enough to think about as it is.
Yeah, and like to your point about professional writers spending time on those random tables. I mean, it's basically the same concept of I go and write the first draft of a novel, and then I pick up a novel that's published and read that, and I'm like, wow, this is so much better than what I came up with. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, yeah, because they went through a lot longer of a process than the thing that I came up with off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. In the moment when I was writing. Like, that person may have gone through 10, 15, 20 edits of their novel before it actually ended up on a store shelf. So I think the same thing applies with the idea of random tables versus coming up with stuff off the top of your head. Or just like, rarely is my first idea as a game master the best idea that I'm going to have.
Yes.
And so it's nice to be able to save some of that mental energy for those much more important sort of linchpin moments in your campaign that you can pour some of that time and energy and thought into. And like you said, if they decide to go to the seaport, well, just pull out a random table, roll up a couple of encounters or, setting details or whatever you need. Mm-hmm. And it's so much easier to build off of something that is there. You're building off of a foundation, even if it's just a 1 or 2 word prompt. Sometimes that's all you need.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sometimes, yeah, you just need that one word or a couple words, and then you're like, oh, I got it, you know. And I think that is another key to random tables as well. And to kind of follow up on what you were saying too about not being the best idea, I think sometimes we get very enamored with that first idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, when I was in college, I studied screenwriting and I did some guerrilla filmmaking and stuff after I graduated. And I remember I think it was some screenwriting advice book or a quote from somebody, like a producer in Hollywood, and they said, you know, he said, well, he or she said, okay, you got an idea for a TV show. That's great. Think of 99 more and tell me that 100th idea.
Yeah.
Right? Because that one's probably going to be the one that would get made. The first one is probably not, right?
Yeah.
Because the first one is probably just going to be, you know, you'll think it's really cool, but if you looked at it for a little bit, you're going to realize it's a little deficient, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just because it takes practice, it takes, you know, experience to really put a new twist onto things. And, you know, the first one that pops into your head probably isn't going to have that. And it's just, it's just kind of the way it goes. And so the random tables, I think, can let you skip to that 100th idea, basically, right? It lets you skip to, you know, or gives you 100 ideas that are all good, right? And that are all interesting, to where you can kind of jump off of that and really, you know, and really make something that is interesting. Now, you did also mention in there solo RPGs, and of course, we'll talk about your podcast here in a bit. You know, it seems like you were playing in groups kind of traditionally, but then somewhere you moved into solo RPG. So why don't you tell us about that experience as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was, like you said, playing in traditional groups for years. And then I think it was in 2019, I discovered Ironsworn. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And played around with it a little bit. And I enjoyed it, but I feel like my first campaign of Ironsworn, I hadn't quite fully understood the system yet. And so I think, as often happens when people start off with Ironsworn, coming from a traditional sort of group setting, especially coming from, you know, more traditional games as well, like D&D, which I had played plenty of Blades in the Dark and, you know, games like that are more narrative driven. But I think when I approached Ironsworn, I approached it like a D&D game. And so I found myself really hammering on the mechanical penalties, you know, the health and the spirit and momentum and supply loss. So every miss that I had that I rolled, I was hammering on those, and I was like, man, this game is really hard, and I'm playing it by myself and I don't know what I'm doing. And I won't say that I got frustrated with it and put it away. I played a few sessions and then I got busy and sort of set it to the side for a while. And then I was toying with the idea of hacking the system into a sci-fi setting. And this was before Starforged, the playtest came out. So I started doing a game of Ironsworn that I hacked to be in my own sci-fi science fantasy universe. And I actually recorded 5 sessions of that, and was kind of playing around with that. And then, as often happens, just got busy and it kind of went by the wayside. And then it sort of lay fallow for a while until 2020, when we were, I was at least home in lockdown for a couple months. And my partner was still working full time. So she was out of the house. So I was just basically home by myself. And that was around the time that the Starforged playtest was really kind of kicking off. So I started to play around with that. And at that point, I had done more like reading of Ironsworn. I had just spent some time digesting some advice that people had posted on the Discord and, the Reddit and stuff like that. And I was just like, okay, I think I've internalized this a little bit more. And so I started playing Starforged, and that was when it really clicked. And I still play with a group, but because we had a bit of an enforced separation, I reached a point where I was like, well, I'm just going to keep playing this solo game until we get back together. And then it kind of spiraled out of control, and I started a podcast.
As things always do with role-playing games. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome. And I mean, there's a lot there because I know some people may not be familiar with Ironsworn or Starforged. But just to talk about, the solo RPGs, maybe we can talk about how Starforged or Ironsworn, how do they allow you to play solo, I guess, would be some interesting things for some people. Could you maybe explain that a little bit for the listeners?
Sure. So I think the cool thing about Starforged and Ironsworn is that it is really a system that is designed with solo or co-op gaming in mind. So GM-less play, either solo or between a couple people. And so the game has tools to essentially stand in for a game master. And so that takes the form of lots of random tables. We've got plenty of Oracle tables that tell you all sorts of things from, settlements to, speaking of Starforged, which is sci-fi, you get your like stellar objects and planets. You can randomly generate a planet in just a few die rolls that is vibrant and has lots of interesting hooks that you can investigate. And then the core conceit of Ironsworn and Starforged is that you are an Ironsworn, this person who goes out and you swear on pieces of iron. And this is a very thematic and meaningful thing in both the fantasy and sci-fi settings of Ironsworn and Starforged. To swear on this iron is to bind your oath to this task that you are going to do. And then there are moves which are similar to, powered by the apocalypse moves and things like that, which have triggers. And so these are really good ways for you as a player to go through. And it's like when you try to overcome some sort of obstacle using your wits, you can make this particular move, and you have something that triggers in your mind as you're going through your fiction. And it helps you to know when to engage the mechanics, and then also know when not to engage the mechanics, and when you can just keep the story going as you are developing it, until you hit that point where you then feel like you've triggered one of these moves, and then you can do the mechanics. And I think the thing that really sets Ironsworn and Starforged apart is that the moves are so well worded and well written that once you've made a move, no matter what happens, if you get a full complete success or a partial success or a quote unquote failure, something interesting happens. And that's a conceit of Powered by the Apocalypse games in general, and moves as a RPG concept is all about, whatever happens when you roll the dice, something has to change. But I think Starforged and Ironsworn really take that to the next level. And I have now played a couple other games solo that were not designed solo, and I used a separate GM emulator, and they work. And I've been able to, I think, have a pretty enjoyable and interesting campaign with them. But there's something in that synergy of the random tables, the oracles, the moves, all working together in Ironsworn, and the fact that it's all one package deal that all is meant to be together. And so you really get to sort of settle into the mode of play. And the game really does, in a lot of ways, take over and guide you through it until you reach a point where you're ready to take control of the narrative.
Yeah. And I had heard of Ironsworn and I had picked it up several years back. I didn't get much of a chance to look into it, but then kind of towards the end of 2020, I discovered Starforged, and I backed the Kickstarter and got the PDF, and I fell in love with it instantly.
Yeah.
It just kind of blew me away. And I don't know what it was, if it was just more concise because it's a preview PDF or whatever, but I was able to, or it was just that I really focused on it when I was reading. It just clicked instantly. I was just like, oh, right. Okay, that's how you would do it, right? Like it was just like, it just clicked. And what I found fascinating really was the way to generate difficulty numbers, right? The conflict resolution system. That is, coming up with difficulty numbers is like 90% what a game master does, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're always saying, oh, that's a 5, in our heads, right? We're 5, 6, okay, 15. Okay, that'll be like a 10. That's what we're always coming up with. And the dice mechanic in Starforged and Ironsworn allows you to roll dice and come up with that randomly. And it blew me away. And I think it's a total game changer. And of course, I know there's some others out there that do similar things, but I just thought that was fantastic, that the idea that you roll 2 10-sided dice plus, your 6-sided die plus a modifier, and the 10-sided dice are the difficulty number or the challenge rating that you get and that you have to beat. I just think that's an incredible system. And it makes so much sense, but like, I didn't think of it, and I probably would have never thought of it, but it like just makes so much sense when I first read it.
It does. And I will say Starforged, I had a similar experience, kind of like I was expressing, where I liked Ironsworn, but I played it a little bit, but didn't quite fully understand it. But I had that similar sort of, when I started with Starforged, it was just everything locked into place, and immediately it became my favorite tabletop role-playing game. And it still is. I would play Starforged every day for the rest of my life and be perfectly happy. I mean, it legitimately, like the way that, like you said, the dice mechanic works, and the way you can generate things off of Oracle tables, and all of these different things combine into a system that could be used for anything, really. Yeah. And I think that's what's cool about it, is it really is an evolution of the original Ironsworn rules, and it takes the best of Ironsworn and makes it better, and also makes everything else better as well, that maybe didn't work for me as well in Ironsworn. And it I don't know, I could wax on and on about how much I love Starforged, but I will not. I will simply stop with, it's the best.
Yeah, it's a ton of fun. And I mean, I knew instantly that I wanted to play. So I even started recording my sessions, and I've released those as a podcast as well, called Forged Among Stars, just because, I mean, I just knew instantly I had to play. I was like, I have to experience these mechanics, and I have to experience this game, even though I was quite pressed for time. And if people listen to the episodes quite closely, they can hear, my baby daughter like kind of sigh and stuff, because I was holding her while I was recording a number of episodes.
Oh, that's awesome.
And just trying to be trying to do it as quietly as possible. So, on some of those episodes, just because the game was so good. And I will be sure to put some links in the show notes for the episode. Give all props to Shawn Tomkin for designing Ironsworn and Starforged. I'll throw links into the show notes so people can check those out there if you want to learn more about those games. But you did bring up something interesting about solo play. that you said at first you were being like really hard on yourself, because sometimes solo play gets kind of a reputation of, oh, well, you can just be soft on yourself all the time. Mm-hmm. And you can just like let your character do whatever. But I always find it interesting because, if you're writing a novel or you're writing a screenplay, unless you're doing some kind of like avant-garde thing, your main character, is not going to die in the first like 15 pages, right? Right. Indiana Jones doesn't die. he gets hit with everything you can imagine, but he doesn't die like right off the bat. And I think that is kind of an interesting balance. And to hear you talk about that a little bit, maybe you can kind of expand on that. So you were hard on yourself, and then you said you kind of started letting, the mechanics kind of take up. How do you kind of walk that balance of just like, playing through your fantasy where your fantasy hero just does everything that you want, or killing yourself on the first bad roll that you get?
Well, I will say, first of all, it makes it really challenging when I have to roll dice, because for whatever reason, I have been cursed with terrible dice rolling luck, whatever dice gods you might believe in, or, whatever. Whenever I roll, I'm just like, man, why do I do this to myself? And honestly, like when I started game mastering, when I discovered systems that as a game master, I didn't have to roll dice, it was all player facing, I was like, yes, finally, I can make things happen. Because when I run D&D, I will, create an encounter, and then I won't roll above a 5 on my D20. And I'm just like, all right, well, I guess you guys are all fine. And nothing bad happened. So that was a boring encounter. So I feel like the challenge for me with solo play, because I'm both the game master and the player, and I'm especially with Ironsworn and Starforged, you're rolling your dice. It's all mixed in together, your 2d10s versus your d6 plus modifier. I often roll misses, or at least, weak hits. And so at first, like I was saying, was in the mentality of, okay, well, my health, my spirit, my supply, those are like my hit points. And so when I miss, I have to take a suffer move to one of those. But I think it was somebody on the Discord wrote this whole long thing, and I went back and read through the rules and realized that they were correct, that really there's maybe 1 or 2 instances where the game makes you take a mechanical penalty for a failure, that most of the time it just tells you to envision a consequence, pay the price, and the pay the price table doesn't tell you take -1 to your health. It just says you are harmed, or you lose access to an item, or something like that. And so that really was the thing that clicked for me of oh, so this is like when I'm writing a novel and I have my very competent character try to break into, this apartment building, and they trigger, an alarm system or something like that. Well, they don't do it because they're incompetent. They do it because there was an extra layer of security that they didn't account for, because this person is extra paranoid. And you then build on these narrative consequences that shape the story and the narrative, rather than just hammering on those health, your health, your tracks of health, supply, and spirit. So I had this in my first season when I was playing Starforged. I had a combat against an extreme foe, which, if you know Starforged or Ironsworn, an extreme foe is what it sounds like. It's extreme. It's very, very dangerous and very easily could kill a character. But because I had reached this point now of realizing that I didn't need to hammer myself with mechanical consequences, that I could do narrative consequences and up the tension. And then every once in a while, you have to hit that mechanical pain point because, you got to make it hurt at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But you can layer on these things. So it's like, oh, you're facing off against this epic, extreme enemy, and you try to run out of the room before they get to you. Well, you fail. Okay. Well, you make it to the door, but they get to the door first and block the way. So now you have to go through, the other direction, and you're running that way. And, the floor falls out from under you and you tumble down to the next floor. And so there are all these opportunities to bring narrative consequences into the game without making your character die after like 2 misses, because that is exactly what would have happened if I had just done purely mechanical consequences in that fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely agree. And I think that was that you stated it well there, that you kind of have to realize that there are other consequences than just harming yourself or harming your character or something like that, that you can give them other complications that are, narratively satisfying without just being like, okay, we're 10 minutes into the game and I've missed and it's really bad, but well, you're not going to die 10 minutes into the game, right? That wouldn't make any sense. That wouldn't make any sense. But there are, an array of consequences that you can think of that would make the situation really bad, really bad for your character, and allow you to kind of overcome those, because that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to give consequences so that the character can overcome them. And then we, as either the player or the audience, right? We cheer when people overcome the obstacles, right? So that's what we want to see. We want to see the miss or the weak hit, the miss and the weak hit, the miss and the weak hit, and then the strong hit, right? And we want to see those kind of moments and have the character kind of come up and overcome those challenges, right? Or, I think it's the same way you view, kind of a D&D session where you all start off, you've spent days or weeks preparing characters, you finally get together in the session, and 10 minutes in, you have a TPK, right?
Yeah.
It's no fun, right?
You want to pack up and go home.
Yeah. You're just like, oh, it's over. Anybody want to watch, reruns or something,
Mm-hmm.
what are we, it's just no fun. Now, spread that out 25 sessions later and there's a TPK, your players and the GM may be cheering, right?
Yeah.
Because this came to a certain point, you got a climax or something happened that is satisfying, right? You feel like, okay, this works. This is perfect. Here we go. Instead of kind of prematurely nixing your character because, you think, I don't want to be soft, so I'm going to be extra hard or whatever like that. But now you've mentioned a couple times. Why don't you tell us about your podcast?
Yeah, so Errant Adventures is the solo podcast that I started at the end of 2020 because my gaming group had actually bought a bunch of equipment for a group podcast that we were going to start recording. And then with the start of the pandemic and everything, we weren't able to continue on with that. So I ended up with all the audio equipment at my house and started playing around with it a little bit. And then when the Starforged playtest came around, I saw a lot of people posting their play reports on the Discord for Shawn to, read through and just kind of get an idea of how people were playing the game. And I thought to myself, well, I have this audio equipment and I struggled with playing Ironsworn the first time because I was trying to basically like type out a narrative. Mm-hmm. And I was, I think, struggling a little bit with the fact that I was just like, well, I could go just write a novel and it would be a much smoother experience because I wouldn't be stopping to deal with these mechanics. And so that's when I struck on the idea to try like recording myself playing. And I did do some recordings of my Ironsworn campaign and then that sort of homebrewed campaign that I talked about earlier. Now that was all back in 2019. So it's now 2020. the playtest has started and I'm part of it. And I'm just like, I've already done a little bit of recording of myself playing. Maybe I should record myself playing Starforged. I'll just do the setting truths and the character creation, and then maybe play a couple sessions, post those up on the Discord. And if they're useful for Shawn, great. If not, then, hopefully I had fun doing it. So that's exactly what I did. I recorded myself, I posted them up there, and then I got some really great feedback, some really kind feedback of people telling me that it sounded really good and that I should throw it up in a podcast feed. And I had already been thinking about it because I did have so much fun recording those, and because I wanted to, dip my toe into the vast pool of actual play podcasts. And since it didn't seem like the group podcast was going to start anytime soon, I was like, well, I've figured this solo thing out, that it's fun for me. I might as well try that. So I started at the end of 2020. I released the first few episodes of Errant Adventures, and I've been going ever since then. I ran my first season for about 35 episodes. That was my Ironsworn Starforged campaign. And then I just recorded episode 23 today of the second season. So probably by the time this comes out, there'll be many more episodes than that. But that is my fantasy setting that I've written stories in before. And I'm using a Powered by the Apocalypse game called The Sword, the Crown, and the Unspeakable Power, which is kind of it's meant to evoke that sort of dark fantasy, Game of Thrones, political intrigue, factions, that kind of thing. And I'm using that in conjunction with the Mythic GM emulator to help run the game for me. And then in addition to those two seasons, I've done a couple of short arcs. I did a 3-part D&D arc, solo arc, where I did some playing around with the MCDM Illrigger, which is a custom class by a company called MCDM. I did 4 episodes of a Colossal playthrough, which Colossal is a solo sort of journaling RPG, which is really, really cool, has a really evocative setting. And then is there something else that I did? I've got a lot of irons in the fire because I've got a lot of ideas for things that I want to do. And it's just a matter of finding the time to record all those things. So I've got a few other things that I've recorded that I haven't released yet, including some cooperative things that I've done. And that's basically the show. It's just me sitting in front of a microphone, telling a story and rolling on random tables and trying to make an interesting and engaging story on the fly. And I think this is the interesting thing about game mastering and all of these things. It's always our first draft. I mean, that when you're playing at the table, the things that happen are your first draft. And so it's a challenge for me because in a lot of ways, the solo podcasting is very much like writing a novel for me. I am very much, as a writer, a gardener, not an architect. So I start with a vague endpoint in mind and a starting situation, and then I just write to see where it goes. And I've never ended at the endpoint that I had in mind at the start. It's always taken me somewhere else. And that's very much how I approach these solo games that I'm playing. Is I start with a character and I start rolling dice and just see where it goes. And hopefully I'm able to pull some sort of interesting and enjoyable story out of it. Otherwise, up with random ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, I think you were saying there you were working on so many things and you had so many ideas. I was just thinking of a game master, might say, a game master might say something like, "Oh, I have no new ideas," like said no game master ever, right? Like, because usually with me and my group, right, some of the players who will GM every once in a while say, "Oh, I have an idea for a campaign. Why don't we just create a group thread and just everybody throw in their ideas for campaigns?" And so, like, most people put in one or two, and then I have like 17.
Right.
I'm like, oh, that Mad Max plus samurais that I wanted to do. Oh yeah, that one, and it's just like, oh yeah, we have all the ideas. So it is really cool to hear about all your different podcasts and the things that you're working on there. Where can people find you? Where on social media? Where can they listen to the podcast?
Yeah, so the podcast Errant Adventures is on all your favorite podcast apps. I also have a website, which is errantadventurespod.com, and that has a media player right in there. And then I also occasionally posts fiction and stuff like that on there to, whenever I can find the time to write a little short piece that helps hopefully flesh out the worlds a little bit. And then I'm on Twitter at ErrantSoloPod as well. And then you can email me at errantsolopod@gmail.com. I'm also on Instagram, though I don't really use Instagram all that much because I'm terrible at social media.
All right. Well, I will be sure to put the links to your website, to your podcast, and your Twitter in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now can head over there and find those links and check out Errant Adventures podcast. Well, Steve, it was a great conversation. Always fun to talk to somebody who loves to play role-playing games. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Matt, for having me. I had a blast.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Steve today. As I mentioned in the show, I have provided links to his website, to his podcast, to his social media in the show notes at dicegeeks.com. Please head over there and check those out. You definitely want to do that. Okay, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You get 20 free dungeon maps. You'll get a custom 5e character background. You'll get some other little PDF tidbits that I have thrown in there for good measure. You'll just have to find out what they are by heading over there. You will also never miss an episode of this show, and each and every Friday you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the wild world of Dice Geeks. All right, guys, I thank you so much for listening. If you would like to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. That would be amazing, but I know that times can be tough, and if you can't do that, I totally understand, but if you have the means, that would be awesome. All right, as I was saying, thank you so much for listening. It is my pleasure to come to you each and every Wednesday, so until next Wednesday, keep gaming!